All right, it's time to start chapter 3. Chapter 3 of Mary Poppins. This chapter is called Laughing Gas. "Are you quite sure he will be at home?" said Jane as they got off the bus, she and Michael and Mary Poppins. "Would my uncle ask me to bring you to tea if he intended to go out? I'd like to know," said Mary Poppins, who was evidently very offended by the question. She was wearing her blue coat with the silver buttons and a blue hat to match. And on the days when she wore these, it was the easiest thing in the world to offend her. All three of them were on their way to pay a visit to Mary Poppins's uncle, Mr. Wigg, and Jane and Michael had looked forward to the trip for so long that they were more than half afraid that Mr. Wigg might not be in after all. "Why is he called Mr. Wigg? Does he wear one?" asked Michael, hurrying alongside beside Mary Poppins. Now you see this picture of a wig. Of course, a wig means fake hair, and this man's name is Mr. Wigg. So Michael is thinking it's because he wears a wig that his name is Mr. Wigg. "He is called Mr. Wigg because Mr. Wigg is his name, and he doesn't wear one. He is bald," said Mary Poppins. "And if I have any more questions, we will just go back home." And she sniffed her usual sniff of displeasure. Jane and Michael looked at each other and frowned. And the frown meant, "Don't let's ask her anything else or we'll never get there." Mary Poppins put her hat straight at the tobacconist's shop at the corner. It had one of those curious windows where there seemed to be three of you instead of one, so that if you look long enough at them, you begin to feel you are not yourself, but a whole crowd of somebody else. Mary Poppins sighed with pleasure, however, when she saw three of herself, each wearing a blue coat with silver buttons and a blue hat to match. She thought it was such a lovely sight that she wished there had been a dozen of her, and even 30. The more Mary Poppins, the merrier. "Come along," she said sternly, as though they had kept her waiting. Then they turned the corner and pulled the bell of number 3 Robertson Road. Jane and Michael could hear it faintly echoing from a long way away, and they knew that in 1 minute, or 2 at the most, they would be having tea with Mary Poppins's uncle, Mr. Wigg, for the first time ever. "If he's in, of course," Jane said to Michael in a whisper. At that moment, the door flew open and a thin, watery-looking lady appeared. "Is he in?" said Michael quickly. "I'll thank you," said Mary Poppins, giving him a terrible glance, "to let me do the talking." "How do you do, Miss Wigg?" Jane said politely. "Mrs. Wigg," said the thin lady, in a voice even thinner than herself, "how dare you call me Miss Wigg? No, thank you. I'm plain Miss Persimmon and proud of it. Mrs. Wigg, indeed." She seemed to be quite upset, and they thought Mr. Wigg must be a very odd person if Miss Persimmon was so glad not to be Mrs. Wigg. So Jane thought that lady that answered the door must be his wife, but he's not married. And the woman that answered the door is his maid. And when Jane called her Mrs. Wigg, she was like saying that this lady is Mr. Wigg's wife, and she was not excited to hear that. She was offended. She doesn't want anybody to think that she's married to Mr. Wigg. "Straight up, and first door on the landing," said Miss Persimmon, and she went hurrying down the passage saying, "Mrs. Wigg, indeed," to herself in a high, thin, outraged voice. Jane and Michael followed Mary Poppins upstairs. Mary Poppins knocked at the door. Come in, and welcome," called a loud, cheery voice from inside. Jane's heart was pitter-pattering with excitement. "He is in," she signaled to Michael with a look. Mary Poppins opened the door and pushed them out in front of her. A large, cheerful room before them. At one end of it, a fire was burning brightly, and in the center stood an enormous table laid for tea, 4 cups and saucers, piles of bread and butter, crumpets, coconut cakes, and a large plum cake with pink icing. Oh, doesn't that sound good right about now? "Well, this is indeed a pleasure," a huge voice greeted them, and Jane and Michael looked round for its owner. He was nowhere to be seen. The room appeared to be quite empty. Then they heard Mary Poppins saying crossly, "Oh, Uncle Albert, not again? It's not your birthday, is it?" And as she spoke, she looked up at the ceiling. Jane and Michael looked up too, and to their surprise, saw a round, fat, bald man who was hanging in the air without holding on to anything. Indeed, he appeared to be sitting on the air, for his legs were crossed, and he had just put down the newspaper which he had been reading when they came in. "My dear," said Mr. Wig, smiling down at the children and looking apologetically at Mary Poppins, "I'm very sorry, but I'm afraid it is my birthday." "Tch, tch, tch," said Mary Poppins. "I only remembered last night, and there was no time to send you a postcard asking you to come another day. Very distressing, isn't it?" he said, looking down at Jane and Michael. "I can see you're rather surprised," said Mr. Wig, and indeed, their mouths were opened so wide with astonishment that Mr. Wig, if he had been a little smaller, might have almost fallen into one of them. "I'd better explain, I think," Mr. Wig went on calmly. "You see, it's this way. I'm a cheerful sort of man, and very disposed to laughter. You wouldn't believe, either of you, the number of things that strike me as being funny. I can laugh at pretty nearly anything, I can." And with that, Mr. Wig began to bob up and down, shaking with laughter at the thought of his own cheerfulness. "Uncle Albert," said Mary Poppins, and Mr. Wig stopped laughing with a jerk. "Oh, I beg pardon, my dear. Where was I? Oh, yes. Well, the funny thing about me is—" "All right, Mary. I won't laugh if I can help it. That whenever my birthday falls on a Friday, well, it's all up with me. Absolutely up," said Mr. Wig. "But why?" began Jane. "But how?" began Michael. "Well, you see, if I laugh on that particular day, I become so filled with laughing gas that I simply can't keep on the ground. Even if I smile, it happens. The first funny thought, and I'm up like a balloon. And until I can think of something serious, I can't get down again." Mr. Wig began to chuckle at that. Then he caught sight of Mary Poppins' face and stopped the chuckle and continued, "It's awkward, of course, but not unpleasant. Never happens to either of you, I suppose?" Jane and Michael shook their heads. "No, I thought not. It seems to be my own special habit. Once, after I'd been to the circus the night before, I laughed so much that, would you believe it, I was up here for a whole 12 hours and I couldn't get down to the last stroke of midnight. Then, of course, I came down with a flop because it was Saturday and not my birthday anymore. It's rather odd, isn't it? Not to say funny. And now here it is Friday again and my birthday, and you two and Mary P to visit me. Oh, Lordy, Lordy, don't make me laugh, I beg of you." But although Jane and Michael had done nothing very amusing except to stare at him in astonishment, Mr. Wig began to laugh again loudly. and as he laughed, he went bouncing and bobbing about in the air, with the newspaper rattling in his hand and his spectacles half on and half off his nose. He looked so comic, floundering in the air like a great human bubble, chuckling at the ceiling sometimes and sometimes at the gas bracket as he passed, that Jane and Michael, though they were trying hard to be polite, just couldn't help doing what they did. They laughed and they laughed and they laughed. They shut their mouths tight to prevent the laughter escaping, but it didn't do any good. And presently they were rolling over and over on the floor, squealing and shrieking with laughter. Really, said Mary Poppins, really such behavior. I can't help it. I can't help it, shrieked Michael as he rolled into the fender. It's so terribly funny. Oh, Jane, isn't it funny? Jane didn't reply, for a curious thing was happening to her. As she laughed, she felt herself growing lighter and lighter, just as though she were being pumped full of air. It was a curious and delicious feeling, and it made her want to laugh all the more. And then suddenly, with a bouncing bound, she felt herself jumping through the air. Michael, to his astonishment, saw her go soaring up through the room. With a little bump, her head touched the ceiling, and then she went bouncing along it until she reached Mr. Wig. Well, said Mr. Wig, looking very surprised indeed. Don't tell me it's your birthday too. Jane shook her head. It's not? Then this laughing gas must be catching. Hi, whoa there, look out for the mantelpiece. This was to Michael, who had suddenly risen from the floor and was swooping through the air, roaring with laughter and just grazing the china ornaments on the mantelpiece as he passed. He landed with a bounce right on Mr. Wig's knee. How do you do? Said Mr. Wig, heartily shaking Michael by the hand. I call this really friendly of you, bless my soul, I do, to come up to me since I can't come down to you. And then he and Michael looked at each other and flung back their heads and simply howled with laughter. I lost my spot. I say, said Mr. Wig to Jane as he wiped his eyes, you be thinking I have the worst manners in the world. You're standing and you ought to be sitting, a nice young lady like you. But I'm afraid I can't offer a chair up here. And I'll think you'll find the air quite comfortable to sit on, I do. Jane tried it and she found she could sit quite comfortably on the air. She took off her hat and laid it down beside her and hung it there in space, without any support at all. That's right, said Mr. Wig. Then he turned and looked down at Mary Poppins. Well, Mary, we're fixed. And now I can inquire about you, my dear. I must say I'm very glad to welcome you and my two young friends here today. Why, Mary, you're frowning. I'm afraid you don't approve of all this. He waved his hand at Jane and Michael and said hurriedly, I apologize, Mary dear. Sorry, I lost my, but you know how it is with me. Still, I must say, I never thought my two young friends here would catch it. I really didn't. Mary, I suppose I should have asked them for another day and tried to think of something sad or something. Well, I must say, said Mary Poppins primly, that I have never in my life seen such a sight. And at your age, Uncle. Mary Poppins, do come up, interrupted Michael. Think of something funny, and you'll find it's quite easy. Oh, now do, Mary, said Mr. Wig persuasively. We're lonely up here without you, said Jane, who held her arms out towards Mary Poppins. Do think of something funny. Oh, she doesn't need to, said Mr. Wig, sighing. She'll come up if she wants to, even without laughing. She knows it. He looked mysteriously and secretly at Mary Poppins as she stood there on the hearth rug. Well, said Mary Poppins. It's all very silly and undignified, but since you're up there and I don't seem to be able to get down, and don't seem to be able to get down, I suppose I better come up too. With that, to the surprise of Jane and Michael, she put her hands down at her sides, and without a laugh, even the faintest glimmer of a smile, she shot up through the air and sat down beside Jane. How many times, I should like to know, she said snappily, have I told you to take off your coat when you come into a hot room? And she unbuttoned Jane's coat and laid it neatly on the air beside the hat. That's right, Mary, that's right, said Mr. Wig contentedly as he leaned down, and put his spectacles on the mantelpiece. Now we're all comfortable. There's comfort and comfort, sniffed Mary Poppins. And we can have tea, said Mr. Wig, apparently not noticing her remark, and then a startled look came over his face. My goodness, he said, how dreadful! I've just realized that the table's down there and we're up here. What are we going to do? We're here and it's there. It's an awful tragedy, awful, but oh, it's terribly comic. And he hid his face in his handkerchief and laughed loudly into it. Jane and Michael, though they did not want to miss the crumpets and cakes, couldn't help laughing too, because Mr. Wig's mirth was so infectious. Mr. Wig dried his eyes. There's only one thing for it, he said. We must think of something serious, something sad, very sad. And then we shall be able to get down. Now, 1, 2, 3, something very sad, mind you. And they thought and thought, with their chins in their hands. Michael thought of school, and that one day he would have to go there. But even that seemed funny today, and he had to laugh. Jane thought, I shall be grown up in another 14 years. But that didn't sound sad at all, but quite nice and rather funny. She could not help smiling at the thought of herself growing up with long skirts and a handbag. There was my poor old Aunt Emily, thought Mr. Wig out loud. She was run over by an omnibus. Sad, very sad, unbearably sad. Poor Aunt Emily. But they saved her umbrella. That was funny, wasn't it? And before he knew where he was heaving and trembling and bursting with laughter at the thought of Aunt Emily's umbrella. Oh, it's no good, he said, blowing his nose. I give it up, and my young friends here seem to be no better at sadness than I am. Mary, can't you do something? We want our tea. To this day, Jane and Michael cannot be sure of what happened then. All they know for certain is that as soon as Mr. Wig had appealed to Mary Poppins, the table below began to wiggle on its legs. Presently it was swaying dangerously, and then, with a rattle of china and with cakes lurching off their plates onto the cloth, the table came soaring through the room, gave one graceful turn, and landed beside them so that Mr. Wig was at its head. Good girl, said Mr. Wig, smiling proudly upon her. I knew you'd fix something. Now will you take the foot of the table and pour out, Mary? And the guests on either side of me, that's the idea, he said, as Michael ran bobbing through the air and sat down on Mr. Wig's right. Jane was at his left hand. There they were, all together, up in the air at the table between them. Not a single piece of bread and butter or a lump of sugar had been left behind. Mr. Wig smiled contentedly. It is usual, I think, to begin with bread and butter, he said to Jane and Michael. But as it's my birthday, we will begin the wrong way, which I always think is the right way, with the cake." And he cut a large slice for everybody. "Morty," he said to Jane, but before she had time to reply, there was a quick, sharp knock at the door. "Come in," called Mr. Wig. The door opened, and there stood Mrs. Persimmon with a jug of hot water on a tray. "I thought, Mr. Wig," she began, looking searchingly around the room, "you'd be wanting some more hot, well, I simply never," she said as she caught sight of them all seated on the air round the table. "Such goings on I never did see. In all my born days I never saw such. I'm sure, Mr. Wig, I always knew you were a bit odd, but I've closed my eyes to it being as how you paid your rent regular, but such behavior as this, having tea in the air with your guests. Mr. Wig, sir, I am astonished at you. It's that undignified, and for a gentleman of your age, I never did." "But perhaps you will, Miss Persimmon," said Michael. "Will what?" said Miss Persimmon haughtily. "Catch the laughing gas as we did," said Michael. Miss Persimmon flung back her head scornfully. "I hope, young man, I have more respect for myself than to go bouncing about in the air like a rubber ball at the end of a bat. I'll stay on my own feet, thank you, or my name's not Amy Persimmon. And oh dear, my goodness, oh dear, what's the matter? I can't walk. I'm going. Help, help!" For Miss Persimmon, quite against her will, was off the ground and stumbling through the air, rolling from side to side like a very thin barrel, balancing the tray in her hand. She was almost weeping with distress as she arrived at the table and put down her jug of water. Thank you, said Mary Poppins in a calm, very polite voice. Then Miss Persimmon turned and went wafting down again, murmuring as she went, "So undignified! And me, a well-behaved, steady-going woman, not giving a single glance backward. Oh, I must see a doctor." When she touched the floor, she ran hurriedly out of the room, wringing her hands, not giving a single glance backward. "So undignified!" They heard her moaning as she shut the door behind her. "Her name can't be Amy Persimmon because she didn't stay on her feet," whispered Jane to Michael. But Mr. Wig was looking at Mary Poppins. A curious look, half amused, half accusing. Mary, you shouldn't. Bless my soul, you shouldn't, Mary. The poor old body will never get over it. But oh my goodness, didn't she look funny waddling through the air? Oh, goodness gracious, didn't she?" And he and Jane and Michael were off again, rolling about in the air, clutching their sides, gasping with laughter at the thought of how funny Miss Persimmon's had looked. "Oh dear," said Michael, "don't make me laugh any more. I can't stand it. I shall break." Oh, cried Jane as she gasped for breath with her hand over her heart. "Oh my gracious, glorious, galumping goodness!" roared Mr. Wig, dabbing his eyes with the tail of his coat because he couldn't find his handkerchief. "It is time to go home." Mary Poppins' voice sounded above the roars of laughter like a trumpet. And suddenly, with a rush, Jane and Michael and Mr. Wig came down. They landed on the floor with a huge bump, all together. The thought that they would have to go home was the first sad thought of the afternoon. And the moment it was in their minds, the laughing gas went out of them. Jane and Michael sighed as they watched Mary Poppins come slowly down the air, carrying Jane's coat and hat. Mr. Wig sighed too. a great, long, heavy sigh. Well, isn't that a pity? He said soberly. It's very sad that you've got to go home. I never enjoyed an afternoon so much, did you? Never, said Michael sadly, feeling how dull it was to be on earth again with no laughing gas inside him. Never, never, said Jane, as she stood on tiptoed, kissed Mr. Wiggs' withering apple cheeks. Never, 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 never. They sat on either side of Mary Poppins, going home in the bus. They were both very quiet, thinking over the lovely afternoon. Presently Michael said sleepily to Mary Poppins, How often does your uncle get like that? Like what? Said Mary Poppins sharply, as though Michael had deliberately said something to offend her. Well, all bouncy and laughing and going up in the air. Up in the air? Mary Poppins' voice was high and angry. What do you mean, pray, up in the air? Jane tried to explain. Michael means, is your uncle often full of laughing gas? And does he often go rolling and bobbing on the ceiling when... Rolling and bobbing? What an idea! Rolling and bobbing on the ceiling. You'll be telling me next he's a balloon. Mary Poppins gave an offended sniff. But he did, said Michael. We saw him. What, Roland Bob? How dare you? I'll have you know my uncle is a sober, honest, hard-working man, and you'll be kind enough to speak of him respectfully. And don't bite your bus ticket. Roland Bob, indeed. The idea. Michael and Jane looked across Mary Poppins at each other. They said nothing, for they had learnt that it was better not to argue with Mary Poppins, no matter how odd anything seemed. But the look that passed between them said, Is it true or isn't it? About Mr. Wigg? Is Mary Poppins right? Or are we? But there was nobody to give them the right answer. The bus roared on, wildly lurching and bounding. Mary Poppins sat between them, offended and silent. And presently, because they were very tired, they crept closer to her and leaned up against her sides, fell asleep, still wondering. That was chapter 3. Time for chapter 4. I really like this chapter because there's dogs in it. And you know that I love dogs. This chapter is called Miss Lark's Andrew. I bet you know that Andrew is the dog. That's his name. Miss Lark lived next door. But before we go any further, I must tell you what next door looked like. It was a very grand house, by far the grandest in Cherry Tree Lane. Even Admiral Boom had been known to envy Miss Lark for her wonderful house, though his own had ship's funnels instead of chimneys and a flagstaff in the front garden. Over and over again, the inhabitants of the lane had heard him say as he rolled past Miss Lark's mansion, Blast my gizzard, what does she want with a house like that? And the reason of Admiral Boom's jealousy was that Miss Lark had 2 gates. One was for Miss Lark's friends and relations, and the other was for the butcher, the baker, and the milkman. In other words, her house is so big and fancy that she has 2 separate doors. One door are for the special people and one door for the workers. Can you believe that? Once the baker had made a mistake and came in through the gate reserved for friends and relations. And Miss Lark was so angry, she said she wouldn't have any more bread ever. But in the end, she had to forgive the baker because he was the only one in the neighborhood who had made those little flat rolls with the curly twists of crust on the top. She never really liked him very much after that, however, and when he came, he pulled his hat far down over his eyes so that Miss Lark might think he was somebody else, but she never did. Jane and Michael always knew that when Miss Lark was in the garden or coming along the lane, because there were so many brooches and necklaces and earrings that she jingled and jangled just like a brass band. Do you see this picture here, friends, of the lady's red shirt? And then there's a beautiful, there's like a jewelry. It's called a brooch. It is basically a beautiful large gem or some sort of design, and you can pin it onto a shirt if your shirt or your dress comes up really high on your neck. And Miss Lark also wore necklaces and earrings. And so if you have all that metal, the metal earrings, the metal brooch, the metal necklace, when you're walking, it's gonna ting, 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 like hit together and make a jingling sound. Apparently she liked that. That was her style. Whenever she met them, whenever Miss Lark met Jane and Michael, she always said the same thing. Good morning, or good afternoon, if it happened to be after luncheon. And how are we today? And Jane and Michael were never quite sure whether Miss Lark was asking how they were or how she and Andrew were. So they just replied, good afternoon, or of course, good morning, if it was before luncheon. All day long, no matter where the children were, they could hear Miss Lark calling in a very loud voice, like things like, Andrew, where are you? Or, Andrew, you mustn't go out without your overcoat. Or, Andrew, come to your mother. And if you didn't know, you would think that Andrew must be a little boy. Indeed, Jane thought Miss Lark thought that Andrew was a little boy. But Andrew wasn't. He was a dog. One of those small, silky, fluffy dogs that look like a fur necklet until they begin to bark. But of course, when they do, you know that they're dogs. No fur necklet ever made a noise like that. Now, Andrew led such a luxurious life that you might have thought he was the Shah of Persia in disguise. He slept on a silk pillow in Miss Lark's room. He went by car to the hairdresser's twice a week to be shampooed. He had cream for every meal and sometimes oysters. And he possessed 4 overcoats with checks and stripes in different colors. Andrew's ordinary days were filled with the kind of things that most people have only on birthdays. And when Andrew himself had a birthday, he had 2 candles on his cake for every year instead of 1. Did you hear that? So when Andrew has a birthday, he gets a birthday cake. And then, so let's say you're 10 years old. So you have 10 candles? No. Andrew, when he turns 10, he gets 20 candles. He gets double. Why? Because he's spoiled. He's a spoiled little dog. He rides in a car for his hair appointment twice a week. So here's a drawing of Andrew. It's kind of blurry, but you can see that he's on a leash with Miss Lark. Those are her feet in the bottom of her dress. The effect of all this was to make Andrew very much disliked in the neighborhood. People used to laugh heartily when they saw Andrew sitting up in the back seat of Mrs. Lark's car on the way to the hairdresser's, with a fur rug over his knees and his best coat on. And on the day when Miss Lark brought him 2 pairs of small leather boots so that he could go out in the park, wet or fine, everybody in the lane came down to their front gates to watch him go by and secretly smile behind their backs. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a dog wearing shoes, but I have. I have seen a dog wearing shoes. And this dog, Andrew, didn't just have any shoes. He had leather boots, which are very expensive. My goodness, this dog is rich. Or his owner is rich, and she really spoils him. Pooh, said Michael, as they were watching Andrew one day through the fence that separated number 17 from next door. Pooh, he's a nincompoop. How do you know? Asked Jane, very interested. I know because I heard Daddy call him one this morning, said Michael, and he laughed at Andrew very rudely. Ha! He is not a nincompoop, said Mary Poppins, and that is that. Mary Poppins was right. Andrew wasn't a nincompoop, as you will very soon see. You must not think he did not respect Miss Lark. He did. He was even fond of her in a mild sort of way. He couldn't help having having a kindly feeling for someone who had been so good to him ever since he was a puppy, even if she did kiss him rather too often. But there was no doubt about it. The life Andrew led bored him to distraction. He would have given half his fortune, if he had one, for a nice piece of raw red meat instead of the usual breast of chicken and scrambled eggs with asparagus. For in his secret, innermost heart, Andrew longed to be a common dog. He never passed his time. He longed to be a common dog. He never passed his pedigree, which hung on the wall in Mrs. Lark's drawing room without a shudder of shame. And many a time he wished he never had a father, nor a grandfather, nor a great-grandfather. If Miss Lark was going to make such a fuss of it. Now, I don't know, friends, if you know what a pedigree is, but basically there is certain dogs. They are purebred, which means the kind of dog that they're really officially that kind. And that makes them valuable. That makes them really valuable. And the reason that the people who own them, they can prove that their dog is, let's say, a poodle, purely a poodle, or purely a golden retriever, or purely a Scottish terrier, or purely a greyhound, is that they have a special piece of paper called a pedigree, which explains and shows maybe a picture and also the name of the dog's parents and grandparents and the dogs that came before them. And it's like the dog's family tree. That's the dog's pedigree. And that makes the dog that helps the dog prove that it's very valuable because of its breed. And so Miss Lark has a piece of paper hanging in her house to prove that her dog is a purebred Yorkshire Terrier. And well, Andrew's embarrassed because it makes him feel like he needs to be a fancy dog when he really just wants to be a common dog. It was this desire of Andrew's to be a common dog that made Andrew choose common dogs for friends. And whenever he got the chance, he would run out to the front gate and sit there watching for them so that he could exchange a few common remarks. But Miss Lark, when she discovered him, would be sure to call out, Andrew, come in, my darling. Come away from those dreadful street Arabs. And of course, Andrew would have to come in, or Miss Lark would shame him by coming out and bringing him in. And Andrew would blush and hurry up the steps so that his friends should not hear him calling her precious. Oh, my joy, my little lump of sugar. Embarrassing for this dog. So embarrassed that it's this woman, Miss Lark, calls him these silly names when he's trying to make friends with all the street dogs. It reminds me of what I do to my dogs. I call them those funny names too, like the sweet little, oh, my honey little sweetie, baby sweetie, this kind of thing. That's what everybody does that when they love their animal, they love their pet. You say, oh, my little heart, my little sweetheart. But some people think that it actually makes the dogs be embarrassed. Andrew's most special friend was more than common. He was a byword. He was half an Airedale and half a Retriever, and the worst half of both. Whenever there was a fight in the road, he would be sure to be in the thick of it. He was always getting into trouble with the postman or the policeman, and there was nothing he loved better than sniffing about in drains and garbage tins. He was, in fact, the talk of the whole street, and more than one person had been heard to say thankfully that they were glad he was not their dog. Do you see the picture of this bigger dog here, the shaggy dog? It's pretty furry. It's a mix between an Airedale and a retriever. And this is the street dog that Andrew is friends with. It's a really, common looking street dog that is not fancy. Right. But Andrew loved him and was continually on the watch for him. Sometimes they had only to exchange a sniff in the park, but on luckier occasions, though these were very rare, they would have long talks of the from his friend. Andrew heard all the town gossip, and you could see by the rude way in which the other dog laughed as though he told it that it wasn't very complimentary. Then suddenly Miss Lark's voice would be heard calling from the window, and the other dog would get up, loll out his tongue at Miss Lark, and wink at Andrew, and wander off, waving his hindquarters as he went, just to show he didn't care. Of course, Andrew was never allowed outside the gate unless he went with Miss Lark for a walk in the park, or with one of the maids to have his toes manicured. Imagine then the surprise of Jane and Michael when they saw Andrew all alone, careering past them through the park, with his ears back and tail up as though he were on the track of a tiger. Mary Poppins pulled the perambulator up with a jerk, in case Andrew, in his wild flight, should upset it and the twins. And Jane and Michael screamed at him as he passed. "Hi, Andrew, where's your overcoat?" cried Michael, trying to make a high, windy voice like Miss Lark's. "Andrew, you naughty little boy," called Jane, and her voice, because she was a girl, was much more like Miss Lark's. But Andrew just looked at them both very haughtily and barked sharply in the direction of Mary Poppins. Said Andrew several times very quickly. "Let me see. I think it's first on your right and second house on the left-hand side," said Mary Poppins. Said Andrew. No. Garden. Only a backyard. Gates usually open." "I'm not sure," said Mary Poppins. "But I should think so. Generally goes home at tea time." Andrew flung back his head and set off again at a gallop. Jane and Michael's eyes were round as saucers with surprise. "What was he saying?" they demanded breathlessly together. "It is passing the time of day," said Mary Poppins, and shut her mouth tightly, as though she did not intend for any more words to escape from it. John and Barbara gurgled from their perambulator. "He wasn't," said Michael. "Well, he couldn't have been," said Jane. "Well, you know best, of course, as usual," said Mary Poppins haughtily. "He must have been asking you where somebody lived. I'm sure he must," Michael began. "Well, if you know, why bother to ask me?" said Mary Poppins, sniffing. "I'm no dictionary." "Oh, Michael," said Jane, "she'll never tell us if you talk like that. Mary Poppins, do say what Andrew was saying to you, please." "Ask him. He knows, Mr. Know-all," said Mary Poppins, nodding her head scornfully at Michael. "Oh, no, I don't. I promise. I don't, Mary Poppins. Do tell." 3:30. Tea time," said Mary Poppins, and she wheeled the perambulator round and shut her mouth tight again as though it were a trapdoor. She did not say another word all the way home. Jane dropped behind with Michael. "It's your fault," she said. "Now we'll never know." "I don't care," said Michael, and he began to push his scooter very quickly. "I don't want to know." But he did want to know, very badly indeed, and as it turned out, he and Jane and everybody else knew all about it before tea time. Just as they were about to cross the road to their own house, They heard cries coming from next door, and there they saw a curious sight. Mrs. Lark's two maids were rushing wildly about the garden, looking under bushes and up into the trees as people do when they've lost their most valuable possession. And there was Robertson A. from number 17 busily wasting his time by poking at the gravel on Mrs. Lark's path with a broom as though he expected to find some missing treasure under a pebble. Miss Lark herself was running about in her garden, waving her arms and calling, "Andrew! Andrew! Oh, he's lost! My darling boy is lost! We must send for the police! I must see the Prime Minister! Andrew is lost! Oh dear! Oh dear!" "Oh, poor Miss Lark," said Jane, hurrying across the road. She couldn't help but feeling sorry because Miss Lark looked so upset. But it was Michael who really comforted Mrs. Lark. Just as he was going in at the gate of number 17, he looked down the lane, and there he saw, "Why, there's Andrew, Miss Lark. See, down there, just turning Admiral Boone's corner." Where? Show me," said Miss Lark breathlessly as she peered in the direction in which Michael was pointing. And there, sure enough, was Andrew, walking as slowly and as casually as though nothing in the world was the matter. And beside him waltzed a huge dog that seemed to be half an Airedale and half a retriever and the worst half of both. "Oh, what a relief," said Mrs. Lark, sighing loudly. "Oh, what a load off my mind." Mary Poppins and the children waited in the lane outside of Miss Lark's gate. Miss Lark herself and her two maids leaned over the fence. Robertson A., resting from his labors, propped himself up with a broom handle, and all of them watched in silence the return of Andrew. He and his friend marched sedately up to the group, whisking their tails jauntily and keeping their ears well cocked. And you could tell by the look in Andrew's eye that whatever he meant business. "That dreadful dog," said Miss Lark, looking at Andrew's companion. "Shoo, shoo! Go home!" she cried. But the dog just sat down on the pavement and scratched his right ear with his left leg and yawned. "Go away! Go home! Shoo, I say!" Miss Lark waving her arms angrily at the dog. "And you, Andrew," she went on, "come indoors this minute. Going out like that, all alone, without your overcoat. I'm very displeased with you." Andrew barked lazily, but did not move. "What do you mean?" "Andrew, come in at once." Andrew barked again. "He says," put in Mary Poppins, "that he's not coming in." Miss Lark turned and regarded her haughtily. "How do you know what my dog says, may I ask? Of course he will come in." Andrew, however, merely shook his head and gave one or two growls. "He won't," said Mary Poppins, "not unless his friend comes too." "Stuff and nonsense," said Miss Lark crossly. "That can't be what he says. As if I could have a great hulking mongrel like that inside my gate." He said, Andrew yapped 3 or 4 times. "He says he means it," said Mary Poppins. "And what's more, he'll go and live with his friend unless his friend is allowed to come and live with him." "Oh, Andrew, you can't really, after all I've done for you and everything." Miss Lark was nearly weeping. Andrew barked and turned away. The other dog got up. "Oh, he does mean it. Oh," cried Miss Lark. "I see he does. He's going away." She sobbed a moment into her handkerchief and blew her nose and said, Very well, Andrew. I give in. This common dog can stay, on condition, of course, that he sits in the coal cellar. Another yap from Andrew. He insists, ma'am, that won't do. His friend must have a silk cushion, just like his, and sleep in your room, too. Otherwise he will go and sleep in the coal cellar with his friend, said Mary Poppins. Andrew, how could you? Moaned Miss Lark. I shall never consent to such a thing. Andrew looked as though he were preparing to depart. So did the other dog. Andrew looked as though he were preparing to depart. So did the other dog. Oh, he's leaving me, shrieked Miss Lark. Very well, Andrew. It'll be as you wish. He shall sleep in my room. He shall never be the same again. Never, never. Such a common dog. She wiped her eyes and went on. I should never have thought of you, Andrew. But I'll say no more, no matter what I think. And this creature I shall call waif, or stray, or... The other dog looked at Miss Lark very indignantly, and Andrew barked loudly. Hoo! They say you must call him Willoughby, and nothing else, said Mary Poppins. Willoughby being his name. Willoughby? What a name! Worse and worse. Miss Lark said despairingly, what is he saying now? For Andrew was barking again. Arf, 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 arf. He says that if he comes back, you're never going to make him wear overcoats or go to the hairdresser's again. That's his last word, said Mary Poppins. There was a pause. Very well, said Miss Lark at last. But I warn you, Andrew, if you catch your death of cold, don't blame me. And with that, she turned and walked haughtily up the steps, sniffing away the last of her tears. Andrew cocked his head towards Willoughby as if to say, come on. And the two of them waltzed side by side, slowly up the garden path, waving their tails like banners, and followed Miss Lark into the house. He isn't an nincompoop, after all, you see, said Jane, as they went upstairs to the nursery and tea. No, agreed Michael. But how do you think Mary Poppins knew? I don't know, said Jane, and she'll never, never tell us. I'm sure of that. And that is the end of chapter 4, and it's right at 8:30. Thank you for listening, friends. Have a wonderful evening. Good night. Bye-bye. See you.